Hello, my name's Patrick Dolan, and I come this afternoon to talk to you a little bit about various organizations and their work. I come sponsored by two organizations specifically. One is called the Consortium for Educational Change. It's centered in Lombard, Illinois. And I will have more to say about its work, but in general, it's 25 years old. It has some special characteristics. It was thought of and funded early on by IEA, which is the National Education Association's state affiliate in Illinois. And that's special because its work, from the very beginning, was designed to supply professional development, support to working teachers and staff across this state, but to do so not only from the point of view of the teacher union, but from some sort of collaborative approach and partnership in which the administration and the union sought to listen to the needs of teachers and respond to them in deep, ongoing ways. Those two characteristics that kind of are in behind that convening approach are really a collaborative culture and a focus on not bits of professional development, but on a kind of a systemic approach in which the entire, at least there was a deep attempt to pull both the school board, the union, the management into a systemic approach to the kinds of shifts and changes that are being contemplated. So I want you to hold that for a minute because it marries up with this group that I really represent today, which is called TURN, Regional Teacher Union Reform Network. That also is about a 20-plus-year-old organization that started nationally, funded by both of the national teachers' organizations and led by both groups from both organizations, which was 20 years ago unusual. It still is a bit rare today. All right. Its job was just a little bit different, and you'll see how they married up about 4 years ago. The Teacher Union Reform Network's idea was to look at their own organization, the union itself, and its contribution to educational reform across the country as it played itself out, but to also do so in a collaborative fashion, invited, slowly built up a kind of a national forum in which union and management teams came to talk about the various waves of reform over the last 20 years. All right. What happened, of course, is that in about 3 or 4 years ago, as these waves of educational reform intensified from 2001 and No Child Left Behind both nationally and then cascading down through the states, through competitive grants, as we all know, in 2008, 9, and so forth, it became rather intense, to say the least, at both local and site levels. And there was a growing need because of the varieties of the way this thing was playing itself out from Tennessee to Florida, California to New York and so forth. It looked like more important to listen to this set of reforms as it was being interpreted regionally. And so we, through CEC, but moving in behind the initiative of the Teacher Union Reform Network, began to set up regions across the country in which we provided some sort of a forum. And I want to talk a little bit about kind of what's at play in these forums and what we think is unique, because in some senses this informs all of our work going forward. There are several prejudices in this approach that TURN uses. And the first one is simply that its job is to look at, if you will, as I mentioned, the systemic nature of this, that is to say, how it plays itself out. And we look primarily, although this is changing and we will talk about that, we look primarily at a local district in which across the country we have more or less the same model in which this is the local board, this is the management, and this, of course, is the teacher union and various other organizations that represent other employees. So this would be 2, 3, 4 unions sometimes representing support, sometimes the folks who do all the janitorial, who do the nursing, who do the secretarial. Sometimes those are the same organizations, sometimes they're separate, but in some senses we've always focused on those 3 groups. And of course, we really want to focus at the point where the work gets done, all right, the school site. And I want to talk and kind of tease that out a bit because in many ways there's a double curriculum The curriculum of this work is crystal clear. It always basically moves around three pieces of the triangle. At the school site, and that's where the work really gets done, and that's where you can see it, there is always an anchor based on the standards in the curriculum, the what of the journey. And that in some senses, of course, varies from K through 12 grades, but it is always constantly in flux and in debate, and no time quite in recent times like today, all right? But the curriculum in some senses is the anchor around the what. The profound kind of delivery, if you will, of this profession, all right, and profound in the sense that it is extremely interesting, as we'll unpack it, because it is not simply a cognitive journey. It certainly is more than that. And it changes emotionally and morally, practically, around the age of a 5-year-old and an 18-year-old in terms of the relationship, the responsibility, the ebb and flow of both the emotional, the moral development, but particularly the cognitive development of the child. There is a group of adults in there that do that interaction, deliver it every day and every hour. And in the process of doing that pedagogy, that engagement strategy, that's the heart of the dance and the heart of the profession. All right? And we'll spend plenty of time talking about making that explicit, what frames and what metaphors one uses to talk about that. And of course, the last and most important piece is that the dance is, of course, with young people. And that learner, all right, comes with all sorts of varied backgrounds that condition profoundly what it is and how fast and how and what kinds of engagement and rules of engagement one uses as the adult to basically catch them, if you will, inspire them, make them in some senses with their native instinct to learn, make them sophisticated, thoughtful learners, but to pay particularly attention to other issues as well, as I've alluded to, the social and economic factors, the growth of the individual child and his or her moral development, and in some senses the citizenship and the social justice wrapped also in that journey. Those are in some senses, that is quite a profound mouthful I've just kind of described. But it is always a play between the what, the curriculum, the how, the pedagogy, and the journey and the work of the learner. And in here are very, very tough issues around how you measure this, how you know whether you're making a difference or not, cognitively and other ways. Second, in the latest, of course, the reform that this whole set of turn talks will take us in, some attempt to measure not only this learner, but to hook that, if you will, to the measurement and effectiveness of the adult that's also involved in this dance, in this wonderful exchange. And that, in turn, obviously is constantly changed by where you peg the standards themselves for all children. So, short and sweet, that's a simple triangle. We all understand that. The play between the what, the how, and the learner. As important as it is, as critical to a society, as critical as it is to that child and those parents, it happens, and here's in some senses our venue, it always happens in some sort of setting. And by some sort of setting, I'm using Seymour Sederson's 30-year kind of frame in those wonderful books that he wrote at Yale in the 60s and 70s. In which he basically said the best word he could think of, is a wonderful kind of professor emeritus of clinical psychology at Yale for 35 years, the best way he could think of talking about a school and a classroom was some sort of intellectual and moral and psychological setting in which this exchange occurred. And of course, he had all sorts of good language around how to talk about that. Well, that's precisely in some senses what we're trying to do in turn. And here's what I mean by that. None of that happens in some sort of isolation or in some vacuum. It happens in an enormously highly politicized and ever-changing set of contexts or settings. All right? And again, never more than in the last 7, 8, 9 years, in which almost every piece of these fairly straightforward in the sense of at least we can enunciate these, This basically is put in play by national policies, transferred to state policies, transferred to local kinds of interpretations of that, with different kinds of resources, different sets of skills, and so forth, in such a way that this plays itself out very, very differently. And it has, in some senses, taken on other kinds of social and, if you will, emotional baggage as well. Somewhat punitive in some of its frame, all right, somewhat dangerous, if you will. Imagine a frame in which out here, the measurement of a child becomes dangerous to the profession, which is the heart of what it is it does. And yet that's precisely what has occurred. None of it intended in many ways, let's hope, but in some senses it has affected all of the play here around the measurement and so forth. And we're going to call some other questions, which is to say, you can talk forever about the how of how education is done, how it is performed, and so forth. But the danger is that you do so in such a way that you never ever get close to and make explicit the set of assumptions out here around what you think this activity is and why in the world a society undertakes this journey in the first place. And so it's important to unpack constantly why this society, this democracy, at this stage in its growth and development, why it thinks this thing called public education is important to it, all right? And why, in some senses, you would have a group of perhaps well-intentioned people who think that, in some senses, the way to improve it is to walk away or around this structure. It's a very important kind of thing to talk about and puzzle about. The issue of what we're doing in here, again, I've alluded to a bunch of different ways, but I want to make it explicit. And we're going to talk about it in a few minutes. That is to say, do you think you are only doing a narrow-focused cognitive journey here with some children around literacy or numeracy? Or do you make explicit, do you talk about and think about the pedagogy here that involves enormous shifts in this child over a period of 12 years in terms of her feeling about herself as a learner, as a moral human being, all right, as a citizen in a democracy? That's a journey that in some senses has moral and social development about it, all right? And that is in some senses also hooked deeply to both social justice and civil religion or citizenship in a democracy, all of which are in some senses involved in the definition of what. Now, I'll come back to that. All I really want to say is, in terms of turn, our goal was to somehow think about where we could create a kind of a thing that came out of both the prejudice of CEC and particularly the insight of turn over the years. Could we provide a venue, a place of 6 places across the country regionally because of the differences, in which there was safety? And by safety, I simply mean safety to talk about quite openly and in a collaborative fashion with one's administration and possibly parents and community as well, to talk about all of the shifts in this basic triangle in such a way that we learn from one another what was and was not working well. So kind of an open learning environment, safe, collaborative, and so forth. But a learning environment particularly sponsored by and focused on the teacher organization that very often in the country is viewed not as someone who is interested in that, but as someone who is blocking it. Far from it. Turn basically says the teacher unions, all right, not only care deeply about that, but they are the appropriate place to find the empowered, thoughtful voice and set of skills in the profession, and find a place where that skill can be in some senses both listened to, learned from, celebrated, and in some senses then used, all right, to redesign the larger system. So it is deliberately a focus on that learning, but it is sponsored by a particular group, but only insofar as they are willing ultimately to bring, all right, and create a collaborative union management environment. So the last piece I want to make explicit is that we use all sorts of voice and expertise, but we begin with the expertise of the teacher. In each one of these regions, there is a curriculum committee, and that committee is made up by teachers and teacher union leadership that drives what it is the curriculum and agenda is twice a year in each of those regions, all right? And that voice is the first voice of expertise. We follow with other voices. We follow with what looks like successful practice, and we bring case study after case study, all right? That means that we're trying to listen across the country to various approaches to evaluation, to changing different ways to measure children's growth, to perhaps think about its linkage to the adults and so forth. We're looking for successful practice, and we are also looking for the traditional forms of expertise. Wherever we think there is an important piece of new discovery, if you will, some research that looks like it's rich and so forth, we will bring it in as well. But the important piece is that the safety, the collaborative, the union sponsor, and the voice of the professional are what guides this and is meant to make it somehow rich, informed, but also to lead us more deeply into reflection and practice around the real efforts around reform. Now, it was very important for us in some senses to define this because it gets defined as everything in this society gets defined in a rather polemical way very often. Some sort of anonymous, not debate as much as exchange of accusations and support in some sort of strange electronic world in which we all now live. But I want to make explicit exactly what it is we're trying to do. We are trying to take that core triangle of standards of curriculum, pedagogy, and the learner, and how to measure and know how she is doing, to take that and constantly reflect down here and use the voice and expertise from California to Florida around what teachers are learning about the shifting elements of that practice, and to bring that up in such a way that we create that thing which is safe, collaborative, reflective, deep voice of the professional, all right, in an ongoing fashion, precisely because we think this is a critical moment in which this profession, it probably has a chance to have deep voice in the redesign of the work, the measure of its own practice in terms of pedagogy, and the definition of what it means for a learner to actually make progress. If those pieces are in play at a certain moment in society, then the professionals who do the work ought to be deeply involved in that evolution. All right? And what we really think is happening is, yes, it cascades down from federal to state to local and all sorts of iterations, all right? But down here it plays real, and it plays real for good and for bad. And our job is to create a venue, a set of venues, all right? Those turn networks that give us the place where we can learn from one another with a certain amount of safety, a certain amount of collaboration, and a certain round of thoughtfulness around where the expertise really lies. So that's our turn. That's in some senses the context of these talks, and that's the way we're going to start this kind of set of reflections.